For 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire was a beacon of civilization, the true heir to Rome's legacy. Its walls were said to be impregnable, its armies mighty, its wealth the stuff of legend. But even the greatest empires can be brought to their knees. What if I told you that the beginning of the end for this millennium-old empire wasn't some long, slow decline, but a single disastrous mistake? A mistake made in a battle they were supposed to win. A battle where a catastrophic error and a stunning act of betrayal would set in motion a chain of events that would change the world forever. This is the story of how a calculated risk became a civilization-shattering defeat. This is the story of the Battle of Manzikert. Section 1. The Inheritors of Rome. To really get the magnitude of the disaster that unfolded on August 26, 1071, you first have to appreciate the titan that was the Byzantine Empire. This wasn't some short-lived kingdom. It was the Eastern Roman Empire, the direct continuation of the power that had once dominated the known world. For centuries after the fall of Rome in the West, Constantinople stood as the largest and wealthiest city in Christendom, a dazzling hub of art, faith, and commerce. Its emperors saw themselves as the rightful successors to Augustus and Constantine, and they commanded a state that was both incredibly sophisticated and brutally resilient. The empire's strength was built on a professional, well-organized military. The core of its army was the tagmata, elite regiments stationed near the capital, ready to march at a moment's notice. The most famous of these were the Varangian Guard, axe-wielding Norsemen and Anglo-Saxons known for their terrifying loyalty and ferocity in battle. The empire's signature weapon was its heavy cavalry, the legendary cataphractoi. These were soldiers and horses almost completely encased in armor, a seemingly unstoppable steamroller on the battlefield. This army was funded by the empire's vast wealth, and the source of that wealth was the sprawling fertile land of Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. The administrative districts there, known as the themes, were more than just provinces. They were the heart of the empire. This region was the primary recruiting ground for soldiers and the source of most of its grain and tax revenue. For centuries, this Anatolian heartland had served as a mighty barrier, a bulwark of Christendom against any threat from the east. But by the mid-11th century, that barrier was starting to crack. Decades of political infighting between the politicians in Constantinople and the military leaders on the frontier had taken their toll. Some emperors had neglected the army, cutting its funding and leaving it dangerously reliant on foreign mercenaries. The empire was overstretched and its frontiers were vulnerable. And out on the vast steppes of Central Asia, a new and formidable power was on the rise. Section 2. The Rising Storm. They were the Seljuk Turks. Originally a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, their recent conversion to Sunni Islam had filled them with a powerful religious and military zeal. They had swept through Persia, creating a vast empire, and by the 1060s their ambitious new sultan, Alp Arslan, the heroic lion, had turned his gaze west toward the rich lands of the Byzantine Empire. The Seljuk military was the polar opposite of the Byzantine war machine. Where the Byzantines relied on heavy armor and disciplined formations, the Seljuks were masters of speed and mobility. Their army was built almost entirely around light cavalry, unbelievably skilled horse archers who could fire off devastating volleys of arrows at a full gallop. They didn't do rigid formations. Instead, they fought in fluid swarms, their signature tactic being the feigned retreat. They would pretend to flee, luring their heavier, slower enemies into a disorganized chase, only to suddenly turn and rain arrows down on their exhausted and exposed pursuers. These weren't just random raids. While Turkish bands had been probing into Anatolia for years, Alp Arslan had bigger plans. In 1067, his forces sacked the great city of Caesarea, a shocking blow that sent a wave of fear through Constantinople. The threat could no longer be ignored. In response, a seasoned general named Romanos IV Diogenes was elevated to the throne in 1068. Romanos was ambitious and energetic, and he was determined to drive the Seljuks out of Anatolia for good. He knew his legitimacy as emperor depended on a decisive military victory. After a few years of smaller, inconclusive campaigns, Romanos decided the time had come for a final showdown. In the spring of 1071, he assembled one of the largest Byzantine armies in living memory and marched east toward a small fortress called Manzikert. It was a campaign born of necessity, but it was also a massive gamble, plagued by fatal errors from the very beginning. Section 3. The Road to Manzikert. The army Romanos led east was a colossal force, maybe 40,000 to 50,000 men in total. It was a multinational host made up of the professional Byzantine corps, including the vaunted Varangian Guard, alongside huge contingents of mercenaries, Normans, Franks, and even Turkic cavalry like the Uzes and Pechenegs. This diversity, however, was a double-edged sword. The loyalty of the mercenaries was always a question mark, and a deep-seated political rivalry was festering at the very heart of the army's command. Romanos was the emperor, but he was seen as a usurper by the powerful Ducas family. The family's patriarch, John Ducas, was his chief rival in Constantinople, and John's son, Andronicus Ducas, a man who had every reason to want the emperor to fail, was given command of the army's reserves. This decision would have unimaginably dire consequences. As the massive army made its long march across Anatolia, Romanos made his first critical and ultimately disastrous mistake. Based on poor scouting, he became convinced that the main Seljuk army under Alp Arslan was far away in Syria, so he decided to split his forces. He sent a large detachment, perhaps as many as 20,000 men, under his general Joseph Tarchaneotes, to attack the nearby fortress of Akhlat. Meanwhile, Romanos himself marched with the rest of the army on Manzikert, which he captured easily on August 23rd. Splitting his army without knowing where his enemy was turned out to be a catastrophic blunder. Alp Arslan wasn't in Syria. Alerted to the Byzantine advance, he had force-marched his army north with incredible speed. He arrived in the area far sooner than Romanos could have ever imagined, his highly mobile force of around 20,000 elite horsemen now ready to pounce. The Byzantine force sent to Akhlat seems to have stumbled into a large Turkish army and, for reasons that are still debated, simply retreated and never rejoined the emperor. The result was the same. Emperor Romanos was now facing the full might of the Seljuk army with a significantly smaller force. On August 24th, his scouts finally confirmed the terrifying truth. Alp Arslan's entire army was here. The trap was set. Even then, battle could have been avoided. Alp Arslan, wary of facing the still formidable Byzantine infantry head-on, sent envoys to propose peace. But Romanos, confident in what he still believed was his superior army and desperate for a glorious victory to secure his throne, rejected the offer. The decision was made. The fate of the empire would be decided on the fields outside Manzikert. Section 4. The Battle That Broke an Empire. On the morning of Friday, August 26, 1071, the two armies prepared for battle. In a powerful gesture, Alp Arslan dressed himself in a white robe, like an Islamic burial shroud, telling his men he was ready to die a martyr. The Byzantine army advanced in its traditional intimidating formation, a long line with the emperor and his elite Varangian Guard in the center, flanked by cavalry. Behind them all was the crucial reserve force, commanded by the emperor's rival, Andronicus Ducas. As the Byzantines marched forward, they saw the Seljuks arranged in a loose crescent shape miles away. The clash began, but not in the way Romanos wanted. The Seljuks refused to meet the Byzantine line. Their horse archers would swarm forward, unleash a storm of arrows, and then immediately wheel away, using their classic hit-and-run tactics. They were like a phantom army, constantly harassing the Byzantines and drawing them deeper and deeper into the field. The heavily armored Byzantine cavalry, built for a decisive charge, was completely useless against these nimble opponents. Frustrated and unable to force a real fight, Romanos pressed his advance all day. By late afternoon, his army had even captured the empty Seljuk camp, but now they were exhausted, strung out, and deep in enemy territory. With nightfall approaching, Romanos made the fateful decision. He ordered a withdrawal back to the safety of his own camp. This is the moment where a bad situation spiraled into a total catastrophe. The order to retreat was complicated, and in the heat and noise of battle, it was misunderstood. As the center, under the Emperor's direct command, began its orderly withdrawal, the flanks fell into confusion. It was at this exact moment of weakness that Alp Arslan sprang his trap. The Seljuks, who had only been pretending to scatter, suddenly wheeled their horses around. Hidden forces that had been concealed in the surrounding hills emerged, closing the horns of their crescent and completely encircling the disorganized Byzantine army. They unleashed a devastating crossfire of arrows into the packed ranks. Panic set in. The Byzantine right wing broke and fled. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. This was the moment of truth for the reserve force under Andronikos Doukas, the very force meant to protect the army's retreat and save the emperor. Instead, Doukas, seeing the chaos unfold, and perhaps, as many historians believe, seizing the opportunity he had been waiting for, deliberately spread the rumor that the emperor had fallen. He then turned his entire reserve force around and marched them away from the battlefield, leaving Romanos and the core of the army to their fate. It was the ultimate betrayal. The heart of the army, now completely surrounded and abandoned, fought on with desperate courage. The Varangian Guard formed a ring of steel around the emperor, their great axes cutting down swarms of Seljuks. But it was hopeless. As darkness fell, they were overwhelmed. The emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, wounded and fighting to the very end, was pulled from his horse and captured. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor was a prisoner of the enemy. The professional core of the Byzantine army was annihilated. It was not just a defeat, it was an absolute catastrophe. Section 5. The aftermath of a catastrophe. The capture of an emperor sent shockwaves across the known world. Romanos was brought before Alp Arslan. In a symbolic gesture, the Sultan gently placed his boot on the emperor's neck before raising him up and treating him as an honored guest. The terms Alp Arslan offered were, all things considered, surprisingly lenient. He demanded a massive ransom, an annual tribute, and a marriage alliance. Critically, he didn't demand huge amounts of territory. Alp Arslan's goal was to secure his own borders, not to dismantle the Byzantine Empire. He released Romanos after only a week. But while Romanos found honor from his enemy, he would find none at home. The news of his capture had raced to Constantinople, and his rivals, led by the Doukas family, had seized their chance. They staged a coup, declared Romanos deposed, and put their own man, Michael VII Doukas, on the throne. When Romanos returned, he wasn't greeted as a returning emperor, but as a defeated traitor. A brutal civil war erupted. Romanos, the man who had marched east to save the empire, was hunted down by his own people. He was defeated, and in a final act of unimaginable cruelty, he was blinded and exiled to a monastery, where he died from his wounds soon after. The defeat at Manzikert was a military disaster, but the civil war that followed was the poison that truly crippled the empire. Section 6. The unraveling of Anatolia. With the Byzantine field army destroyed and the empire tearing itself apart in civil war, a massive power vacuum opened up in Anatolia. The border defenses had simply collapsed. Now, countless bands of Turkmen tribes, whom even the Seljuk Sultan had trouble controlling, began to pour across the undefended frontier, looking for new pastures for their flocks. This was the true, lasting consequence of Manzikert. It wasn't a lightning-fast conquest, but a slow, relentless demographic and cultural takeover. Within just a decade, the situation was catastrophic. By 1080, an area of nearly 30,000 square miles of central Anatolia was under Turkish control. The great cities that had been the bedrock of the Byzantine heartland fell one by one. The empire lost its primary source of soldiers, food, and taxes at a single stroke. The loss of Anatolia was irreversible. In a grim irony, the weakened Byzantine factions even started hiring Turkish mercenaries to fight each other in their civil wars, which only entrenched Turkish power deeper inside the empire's old borders. The Turkification of Anatolia had begun, permanently changing the region from Christian and Greek-speaking to Muslim and Turkish. The story of Manzikert is a chilling reminder of how quickly centuries of power can be undone by a single mistake. If you find these pivotal moments in history as fascinating as we do, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell to join us for more stories about the decisions that shaped our world. Conclusion. It took nearly a decade for a new, capable dynasty under Alexios I Komnenos to finally begin to stabilize the crumbling empire. But the damage was done. The heart of the empire was gone forever. The Battle of Manzikert stands as one of history's most decisive turning points. A single disastrous military decision, splitting the army, was compounded by a single act of political betrayal. Together, they did more than lose a battle. They opened the floodgates for the transformation of Anatolia. This one defeat directly weakened Byzantium so severely that it led to the call for Western aid that would become the First Crusade. And most profoundly, it laid the groundwork for the rise of the power that would one day conquer Constantinople itself, the Ottoman Empire. The mighty Byzantine Empire would hang on for almost 4 more centuries, but it would be a shadow of its former self, a remnant fighting for survival. It never truly recovered from that single disastrous day in 1071, when one mistake on a dusty field in eastern Anatolia cost an empire everything.
Subscribe for more historical nightmares from the past.